From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, yesterday was CPI numbers, today is retail sales numbers. And like the CPI numbers, retail sales came in higher than expected. Here to explain it all to us and put it into the puzzle of the U.S. economy, welcome Michael McKee. He is Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So numbers coming in higher, Mike.
It is a puzzle out there. Now, presidents take the blame for bad economies, so we can let Joe Biden take the credit for the good news today. Actually, it's all Brian Deese's fault. You're going to talk to him. He did this. Retail sales come in up 3% in the month of January after being down 1.1% in December. The control sector, which is basically what goes into GDP from retail sales, up 1.7% after a decline in December. Then later we got the industrial production numbers. Industrial production manufacturing up 1% after a 1.8% decline. What's going on here? We don't really know, but it looks like the economy is stronger than analysts and Wall Street and the Fed thought. It's giving some weight to the idea that maybe a soft landing is possible. You take a look at the scenarios, and we're seeing economists start to revise up their forecasts for growth in the quarter, and the Atlanta Fed GDP now numbers coming in stronger. And then we're seeing this kind of story here with IP and retail sales coming up to meet the new forecast. So maybe that is possible. The question is, what does the Fed do about it, or how do they react? Well, the Fed terminal rate has been moving up, the highest rate that market thinks the Fed is going to get to, now almost 5.5%, which is about 25 basis points more than the Fed had suggested at their December meeting. They've got another meeting on March 22nd. We'll get some new forecasts then, David, and we'll get their reaction to all of this as they speak throughout the coming weeks.
Thank you so much to Michael McKee for being here once again. Well, we've been calling it a puzzle, and yesterday we talked to various people on Bloomberg about what the CPI numbers meant, and we can put it together with the retail sales numbers now. For inflation and for what the Fed might do, we talked to economists as well as a Richmond Fed president. This is what they said.
If it persists, we'll have to do more.
It's going to be tough to get inflation down anywhere close to where the Fed would like to see it.
The most likely scenario, and I give it 50%, is that we end up with sticky inflation, 3 to 4%.
They're going to say it's going to get back to 2%. We're just taking longer.
It's going to take a while to get to there.
But enough with all the speculation analysis. Let's go to somebody who has the answers. He is Brian Deese, and he is the director of the President's National Economic Council. Brian, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So what do you make of these numbers? Because they seem to be really indicating that maybe the economy is stronger than we thought it was, but maybe your inflation is more stubborn than we had hoped it was.
Well, look, these are positive numbers. I think everything about the economy right now counsels humility because we're seeing a lot of things that defy, traditional models or historical examples. When I look back, I look over the last 6 months and I see an economy that has shown more resilience than a lot of people projected in the labor market and ongoing resilience consumer-wise. We certainly see that in this number. And at the same time, over that 6-month period, a cooling in inflation. There's more that we need to see on that front. But those two dynamics happening at the same time, I think, counsel that we are seeing more optimism and more prospect of the kind of transition to steady and stable growth that the president has now been talking about for some time. So, humility is in order, but certainly this is good news. And the combination of a resilient consumer and a resilient labor market, I think, counsels well for our future prospects.
Yeah, and Brian, none of us can be less than happy with more people having jobs, with people spending more money because they have more money to spend. That's good news. But go back to the inflation you mentioned, because although it is coming down relatively slowly, and it's still at very high levels. If we had the levels 5 years ago we do now, we wouldn't even have believed it. So you've said before, inflation is job number one. Are you getting that job done?
Well, look, I wouldn't understate the degree to which we've seen cooling. This quarter last year, a 3-month annualized basis, inflation was running above 7%. And now on a 3-month annualized basis, looking backward, headline inflation is running at about 3.5%. So we have seen meaningful cooling. And I think the question going forward is, where do we see that additional cooling come from, and where can we see that? For consumers and for people who are interacting with the economy, of course, the headline, does matter, and energy and food prices matter a lot. We've seen gas prices move a little bit up, a little down, but the bottom line is they're down quite significantly from several months before. We're seeing some cooling on that food at home, grocery store prices as well. Within the core, I think we got to keep a close eye on housing prices, and I think most people who look in that category believe that the actual printed data is probably 6 months behind what's happening economically in real time right now. And we're going to, keep a close eye on services inflation as well.
Brian, one of the reasons I think we focus on core to some extent is it can be stickier than some of the headline. No question, as you say, headline counts. That's real money being paid by people for gasoline and things like that. But core can be stickier. Where are you on the question about whether we can keep reducing inflation at the current rate? Some people think, yeah, we can just keep going. Others people think it gets harder and harder as you go down.
Look, I think we should. I really do think that this causes humility and a careful, data-dependent outlook, because the past analogs that we use and the models that we use are, continuing to be proven off for the particular circumstances of this crisis and this recovery. When I look at this, I really try to look at what are the measures of labor market expansion. It was good to see an increase in labor force participation across time. And so, look, I think that as you move down, certainly you're less likely to see the kind of deceleration in the inflation numbers persist indefinitely. But, then again, we also know that, for example, on the housing side, we are very likely to see an increase in sequential cooling as well. So, I think we have taken the position here for some time that we can see inflation come down without having to give up all the economic gains we've made. I think the data of the last several months is consistent with that view, and certainly that's what we want to see. And so we're going to keep working on the policy side on things where we can to try to help encourage that outcome.
Brian, I'm mindful of the fact that your tenure is coming to an end, I believe, at the end of this week, and we really appreciate you coming on Bloomberg, particularly because you can get your voice over those backhoes behind you, which not everybody can do. Congratulations. So now we have Lael Brainerd coming over from the Fed to take your position. What tools are you leaving behind for Lael Brainerd to use? What can she use in order to get inflation down, understanding the Fed is in the first position?
Well, first, Lael is going to be an extraordinary leader and counselor for the president. Just brings this breadth of expertise and context, having not only been at the front and center of these macroeconomic debates, but also having worked at Treasury and at the NEC previously as well. I think the core tools that the entire economic team and the president will have here are the tools to implement the historic pieces of legislation that we passed last year. Most of the work involved, whether it is prescription drugs or lower energy prices or more infrastructure and semiconductor facilities that will help reduce price bottlenecks in our transportation system. All of those are coming online. 2023 and 2024 are going to be the big years of implementation of those provisions. There's a lot that we need to get right. There's a lot that needs to get done well in that context. But I think that's going to be the principal set of tools that the economic team and the president will have.
Brian, I'm sure it's time for you to reflect back on what you've been doing here for the last 2 years. What are you proudest of as you look back on the accomplishments?
Well, yeah, look, I'm proud of this team. I'm proud of this president navigating through a historically unprecedented period of time. I think the historically strong and equitable nature of this labor market recovery and this recovery overall is something that, I think that the American people should take pride in. We've defied a lot of odds, and also the fact that it was not a straight line. We talked about it a lot over the course of time, but that we were able to get these 3 big pieces of legislation on infrastructure, chips, the Inflation Reduction Act, that I think will provide a long-term public investment support to help increase productive capacity in parts of our economy that we have failed to invest in for too long. And I really think that even as we look across the short-term economic dynamics that obviously we're talking about here, over the medium term, those investments in the country in building our industrial capacity, I'm quite hopeful will bear real fruit.
People, whether fairly or unfairly, give you a lot of credit for getting things like the Inflation Reduction Act done, dealing with people like Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia. Whatever the truth of that is, are you saying that basically Lael Brainerd will be more, as you say, implementation, so it won't be as important for her to deal with Capitol Hill?
Well, look, every aspect of this job is important. I think that this next 2 years, there's going to be a priority on implementation and execution that is the nature of where we are in this cycle. We passed some very significant pieces of legislation last year, and so therefore effective implementation has got to be a priority. At the same time, there's going to be important issues to deal with the Congress. And while there's obviously a lot of focus on some of the challenges and the debt limit and resolving, making sure that we, maintain the full faith and credit of the United States is going to be important, I also believe, I'm optimistic that there will be more opportunities to make bipartisan progress on things that matter. Maybe not at the very high level consequential, but the things that will matter at the margin. And you always want to be ready to take advantage of those opportunities.
And finally, Brian, I've been looking hard, and I haven't seen an announcement of what you're doing next. So if you wanted to make an announcement here on Bloomberg, we wouldn't stop you. Do you have any sense of what you want to do next?
I have no announcement to make because I'm going to walk out the door, take a beat, go home to my family, and then figure it out. I'm eager to figure out that next chapter, but I'm not going to do that until I leave here.
Makes good sense. And once again, thank you for all of the times you've come on with us here. Thank you, Brian Deese. He is director of the U.S. National Economic Council at the White House. Coming up, the U.S. and China continue to jockey over those unidentified objects shot down over North America. We're going to talk with China expert Susan Thornton of Yale Law School. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the back and forth over these objects, whatever they are, the first was a balloon, the others we're not sure about, over North America, continues between the United States and China. And one of the most recent developments is actually the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, that is Wang Wenbin, saying this earlier about U.S. overreaction.
The U.S. has insisted on the use of force, overreacted, and escalated the situation, and used it as a pretext to illegally sanction Chinese enterprises and institutions. China firmly opposes this and will take countermeasures in accordance with the law against the relevant U.S. entities that undermine China's sovereignty and security and resolutely safeguard national sovereignty and legitimate rights and interests.
To help us put all this in a broader perspective, we turn now to a true China expert. She's Susan Thornton, senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. She has spent her career really as a diplomat focused on China and on Asia, rising to be at one point acting assistant secretary of state for East Asian and Pacific affairs. So Susan, thank you so much for being back with us. You do have a perspective that we really need, and how big a deal this really is. Is this just the pot calling the kettle black, or is there something more profound going on here, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think this incident really shows the danger of a lack of communication between the U.S. and China. I think it is something that needs to be handled and managed. It's obviously something that the U.S. sees as a threat. It was something that was spotted by a civilian in Montana and needs to be discussed and dispensed with. But it's not a huge crisis, but it's becoming a huge crisis because of, I think, the lack of diplomatic channels that we have.
Well, speaking of that, there are reports, Bloomberg's reported at least, that they are considering the State Department, perhaps the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, meeting with Wang Yi, who's, as I understand it, the state counselor responsible for diplomacy, maybe over at the Munich Security Conference. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. It's a good way to sort of set the channel back in motion. It's lower profile than Tony Blinken going to Beijing. I definitely think we need to have him go to Beijing. He needs to meet with all the full range of Chinese leadership, including Xi Jinping, which apparently was going to happen when he was earlier scheduled to make that visit. And I think that's very important. Making these meetings between the U.S. and China normalized, it's regular diplomacy. We talk to other big powers, other important powers. We have to talk to the Chinese, and we can't just cancel every time something comes up. It's a really complicated relationship. Things are going to come up, and we've got to keep the channels open. It
strikes me that it's a complicated relationship in part because it's not just, on the one hand, President Biden, and on the other hand, President Xi. We have Congress involved as well. And it's not just Republicans. A lot of Democrats as well are very active in their expression of concern about China. How much does President Biden have to react to what he's hearing from people who might be more hawkish, if I can use that term, about China?
Yeah, well, it is a very political season in Washington, and we're in a very politicized time, obviously, in general, just on this point of partisan sort of politics in Washington. So I think that is a real constraint on President Biden and how he deals with China. He's continually said that he wants to show that he can responsibly manage this relationship with China. We need to have guardrails. We need to make sure things don't go off the rails. But, you know, the sort of constant sort of simmering in politics in Washington makes it hard when every little issue wants to be played up.
There was a report, I don't know if you saw it or not, that ASML, that's the Dutch company that makes that lithography machine that allows you to make high-tech chips, as I understand it. They're saying they now have a second instance of theft of some of their intellectual property by China. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what it proves to be. I'm not sure exactly what the value is. But put that, again, in a larger context of what's going on in the semiconductor and larger tech real rivalry between the United States and China.
Well, obviously, the technology that ASML has is unique to ASML, and it's crucial for China to continue to be able to produce its own semiconductor chips. I don't think ASML provides the most high-end lithography machines to the Chinese, but they have been selling an awful lot of lower capability lithography machines, and the Chinese need that. I don't know about this particular case of cyber theft. Obviously, cyber theft is an ongoing concern for lots of U.S. companies with respect to China, and has been over the years. So maybe that's something new, or maybe not, I can't say. But the technology that ASML has is really key to China's ability to continue to move up the technology ladder. And so you could see where, you know, they would be trying to do whatever they could to get that technology. And I'm sure ASML is trying to protect it.
So, Susan, you've both done the diplomacy with China, and also you've studied those relations over time. When we talk about guardrails, it strikes me that some people are saying we should find at least some things we can agree on and move forward on, and other things we're just going to have to agree to disagree about and really compete against each other. Do you have a theory about which falls in which bucket?
Yeah, I think it's very dangerous to see the U.S.-China relationship only through the lens of competition, David. I mean, we are going to compete. It's going to be, pretty, serious competition. There's going to be a lot of jostling. But to balance that off, and because we need to also pursue many other interests with the Chinese, we need to have a lot of things we can cooperate on. So the guardrails is sort of part of a negotiation to manage that competition. But then we also need to have things that are positive, and the Chinese like to say win-win. That's become kind of a dirty saying in Washington now, but it actually conveys exactly what you want to have in diplomacy. You want to have a negotiation and some kind of an outcome where both sides get something. That's what it's all about. And that's what we're failing to do, I think, right now with the Chinese. I mean, we have a huge economic relationship with China that we need to sustain and hopefully grow. And that would be of mutual benefit to both countries, obviously.
Well, whether we call it a win-win or not, as you say, a negotiation, at least any I've ever done, the only way you're going to get there is to figure out something that you want and that I want, and we can agree on wanting and somehow find a way to get there. Do you have an example where that would be true, where this would be a priority for President Xi? He really needs this with or without the United States, and President Biden similarly needs it.
Well, I think the trade relationship is key here. The Chinese and the U.S. are both trying to sort of boost their economic growth. They're also trying to help their communities that are maybe less able to recover from the pandemic and other economic sort of downturns. And these are areas in the middle of the United States, in the inland interior of China. Things like agricultural exports from the U.S. are extremely important to the heartland of this country. Things that the Chinese want to do, like send students over here, would be also very beneficial for all of the sort of communities that host educational institutions in this country. And on the other side, I mean, of course, the Chinese would love to see more U.S. business people coming and investing in China. That's become also kind of a dirty word in Washington, but the fact of the matter is we have $750 billion worth of investment in China, and we are serving the Chinese market, 1.4 billion people, which is certainly of interest to our companies and companies around the world. So I think economic cooperation is huge. Other global challenges, debt restructuring, climate change, healthcare are all important.
Susan's always great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. Susan Thornton, she's senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. Still to come, we're going to talk with European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic about EU-U.S. coordination on energy policy in the wake of Russia's war on Ukraine. And a program note now, I'm going to sit down for an exclusive interview with GM CEO Mary Barra on Bloomberg TV and radio tomorrow afternoon at 3:30. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the market's been watching the CPI numbers yesterday, and now the retail sales numbers today. And so now it's time for us to take a look at the markets and see how they reacted. And for that, we turn to Kriti Gupta. Kriti.
Yeah, it's interesting to see these eco data really hold up, David, because you're seeing that retail sales number come in much, much stronger. It's driving some of the price action. So is the earnings story, and it's coming out with essentially the same read, corporate America and the eco data itself, which is the consumer is still strong and they are still spending. And you saw that Airbnb earnings, TripAdvisor, even Kraft Heinz today saying, look, we're raising our prices, things are getting more expensive. People are still buying. It hasn't deterred them, as I think was the fear for a good chunk of last year. Nevertheless, that pushing the 2-year and the 10-year even higher. We're looking at a 2-year yield of 4.62 and a 10-year about 3.81, actually breaking out of its trading range at the far end.
It was like 3.7, 3.75 or something like that, right?
Yeah, that was the technical level. And it's been testing that level for, I think, about 3 sessions now. So to break out is a pretty big deal. The next level is at about maybe 3.90. So it is kind of climbing in that direction. But that's really one where you see all of the action, because the equity market is doing a whole lot of nothing right now. The immediate reaction is if you are pricing in a 5.5% Fed funds rate, which, by the way, is what the market is pricing, you would expect a much more severe stock market reaction. And yet the S&P 500 only down about 0.4%. And the NASDAQ actually in positive territory, marginally, but in positive territory.
And in the meantime, the dollar's up across the board.
It is up across the board. And what's interesting is the dollar traditionally is tied to the hip of the 2-year yield, which in turn is tied to the hip of the Fed. And this time around, it looks like it's mostly driven actually by weakness in the euro. So it's the European story that's driving the bid into the dollar as opposed to U.S. fundamentals.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much, Kriti, for all this reporting on the markets. And you can watch Kriti again when she'll be anchoring at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, we're going to get to talk to the European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic on EU energy policy in the face of Russia's war on Ukraine. He's been in the United States talking with U.S. officials and companies, talking about what they can do about their natural gas situation to ameliorate some of the pressure on the EU. That's coming up next, and it will be on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. We have some breaking news right now on the terminal. According to the Wall Street Journal, the White House is at least considering nominating Austin Goolsbee to be the new vice chair to replace Lael Brainerd, who's going to the White House. Austin Goolsbee, as we know, served under President Obama, and we've seen him often on television. But that's the report, that they are at least considering nominating Austin Goolsbee for vice chair of the Fed. We turn now from the Federal Reserve to energy, and particularly energy in Europe. And Europe has been under a lot of stress and strain for energy ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's done a lot to try to address that issue. We welcome now somebody who's working on that very hard. He's Maros Sefcovic. He's European Commission Vice President for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight. So, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for being here. I know you're visiting Washington on this very subject, and as I understand, one of the important parts of your policy is to develop a joint platform for buying natural gas for Europe. What does the United States have to do, or U.S. companies have to do, to help you get that done?
And the short answer would be keep it coming. But of course, it's much more complex than that. First and foremost, I really expressed my appreciation to our American partners, because since the very important strategic meeting of President Biden with the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, where the energy security was one of the topics, indeed, United States and its companies supplied Europe with 56 billion of cubic meters of gas, which was extremely important because, as you know, we are dramatically getting rid of the fossil supplies from Russia. We want to diversify and see our American partners as a natural allies in this effort. We also want to learn from the last year where, because of the, I would say, bidding competition between the European companies, the prices for gas went through the roof in August. We've been in the realm of 350 euros for megawatt hour of gas, and therefore our heads of states and government of the EU member states decided we should set up a joint platform where we will, for the first time in the history of the European Union, will do our utmost to purchase at least part of our gas supplies together. So yesterday I had very good meetings with LNG majors from US, European majors in this area as well. So we had a networking, good discussion, and I had very constructive meetings with the administration, with the senators, and I see that there is really mutual interest in making this happen, and we'll do our utmost to create conducive conditions that this will be interesting not only for political level, but for companies as well.
Let me press you just a little bit, if I could, Mr. Vice President. If I understand the arrangements correctly, do you have any companies yet who've signed on to say, yes, we will sell to this joint buyer in Europe?
We are not there yet, but we see a lot of interest. Yesterday in that meeting, there have been all major companies from US who've been asking very concrete questions: what needs to be done, how much gas we would need, what would be the conditions. And I explained to them that currently we are in the process of aggregating demand. So we have responses from our member states, how much gas they would like to purchase through this joint platform, which companies should be part of that effort. And in the meantime, we are in a very close contact with the US companies, and we would like to come up at latest by mid-April with our proposal on the table. We'll start this joint purchase, our procurement of gas for the next filling season. And of course, I hope, and after yesterday's meeting, I'm very much reassured that we will have very solid American support and supply of American LNG coming to Europe this year.
Mr. Vice President, of course, energy comes not just from fossil fuels, but from others, so-called renewables. We have the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, which has been something of a bone of contention so far between the EU on the one hand and the United States on the other. Where are you in trying to resolve that tension? And as a practical matter, is the United States getting ahead of Europe in investment in renewables?
I would start with the fact that we've been, of course, very happy that European Green Deal serve a certain inspiration for our American partners. And I think it's very crucial that such a big economy like American one is pulling in the same direction as we in Europe to be climate neutral by the mid of the century, because we know that that planet and the humans living on this planet really need to tackle the climate change. So therefore, I would say this part of the effort is very much appreciated in Europe. Of course, there are some other elements which we are studying carefully, and my message to our American partners was, let's look at IRA as an area how to build additional bridges between Europe and the United States, and let's avoid the situation that it could create barriers or obstacles to our technological cooperation, to our trade. And I think we have to address these issues. And of course, the competition, how to tackle the climate change, is a very good one. But I hope that other parts of the competition, when we will be talking about EVs, about the batteries, about future-oriented technologies, there I think that we need to work as a partners, as a strategic ally as much as possible. And in that respect, if you allow me just to mention one more area and sector where we really need to join forces, this is access to critical raw materials. You need them in the United States, we need them in Europe. Without critical raw materials, lithium, titanium, rare earth, we simply will not be able to accomplish this transition into a greener, more digital world. And therefore, that was my plea, my suggestion to our American partners. Let's work on this together, because it requires a lot of capital, very strong diplomatic muscle, and strong political support.
One last one, if I could, and I'll confess it's outside of energy. You might even think it's outside the United States, but I know the United States is very concerned about it. That is the relations with Northern Ireland, between the EU on the one hand and the UK on the other hand. We know there's been some tension there. What are the prospects of getting that resolved? And let me even push it farther and say by St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, I have to say that with a new Prime Minister, number 10, Mr. Rishi Sunak, and with my new partner, Foreign Secretary Cleverly, and Secretary for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris. We have an excellent relationship, and we are working very hard on the joint solutions, which would take care of, I would say, day-to-day concerns of the people living in the Northern Ireland. And we are looking for the ways how to solve this issue to the benefit of all communities in Northern Ireland. Our joint goal there is not only to resolve the outstanding issues in this joint manner as a good partners, but also to bring something which would complement that effort to build peaceful relationship on the island of Ireland, and especially in Northern Ireland, by adding very important aspect of prosperity. So the first 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement was about peace. Next 25 years should be about peace and prosperity. And this was the topic we discussed with our American friends. And I'm sure that we will be both doing our utmost, not only to resolve this problem, but bring a lot of investors and new prosperity to Northern Ireland.
Well, your American friends, I know, wish you well in that endeavor. Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. Really great to have you with us. As Maros Sefcovic, he is European Commission Vice President for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight. Coming up, the humanitarian crisis in Turkey and northeast Syria. We're going to talk with David Miliband. He's President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee about what his people are seeing on the ground. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The world has looked on in horror at the result of those earthquakes in southeastern Turkey. But it wasn't just southeastern Turkey that was affected. It was also northeast Syria, which is an area that has been the victim already of the civil war there. We welcome now somebody who knows terribly well what's going on there because he has a lot of his colleagues there. He's David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Mr. Miliband, of course, earlier served as British Foreign Secretary under Prime Minister David Cameron. So, David, thank you so much for being with us. Give us
one thing, David.
Yeah.
I wasn't foreign minister under David Cameron. You could create a great big political story about that because he was the Conservative government that succeeded us. I was on
you were
the
Labour. Sorry,
of Gordon Brown. That's right.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, David. Thank you for correcting.
No worries.
But let's go back to Turkey and particularly northeast Syria. Give us a sense of what's going on there now.
Yeah, the lines of the earthquake cut across national lines. So it was the southwest of Turkey focused on Gaziantep, and the northwest of Syria focused on Idlib province and neighboring province of Aleppo. Now, the crushing thing about the situation in northwest Syria is that the earthquake disaster was piled on 10 years of civil war. The northwest of the country is run by armed opposition groups, not by the government in Damascus. And in fact, the government in Damascus, with Russian support, have been in active conflict with the governing rebel authorities in the northwest of the country over the last few years. 145 people were killed, civilians were killed last year. So this is crisis terrain, it's contested terrain, it's incredibly poor terrain. And just to cap it all, the northwest of Syria isn't just the home to 2.5 million people who've lived there for many generations. It's home to 2 million other Syrians who've fled there from the fighting elsewhere in the country. So you can see that when my colleagues and I talk about a crisis upon a crisis, we're talking about an earthquake crisis on top of 10 years of civil war, which have decimated the northwest of the country. And so today, the greatest needs are in the northwest of Syria. The greatest gap between needs and provision is in the northwest of Syria. That's not to say at all that the situation in Turkey is fine. It's not. But we've got to make sure that these poor, benighted people in the northwest of Syria finally get some help and attention.
So David, given the situation, it would be a horrific task to get the people and the supplies in if there were no other issues. We're seeing that in Turkey. Can you get the people and supplies into this area?
Well, we've got the people in, David, because there are staff, my colleagues, who work there and are recruited locally, 400 or so of them, running health services, water and sanitation services, economic livelihood support, education, and have been for 10 years. And they are people from the northwest of Syria and people who've been displaced into that region. So we don't have a problem getting our staff in. I mean, their problem is they can't get out. They're trapped there. but they do work for us. And the critical thing is whether they have supplies, whether our nurses and doctors get the medical supplies, whether the cash delivery is working, whether we can get household supplies. So that's the issue.
David, you mentioned cash supplies. What about funding? Where is funding coming from at this point? To what extent are governments funding the United Nations, or are you relying on private funds?
Well, we are relying mainly on private funds at the moment. There's been an extraordinary appeal in the United Kingdom, the Disasters Emergency Committee, which goes into action 2 or 3 times a year. We're a member of that. It's raised about $70 million from the British public, which is a real outpouring of generosity. There are UN funds, and the UN is the largest food distribution agency in the northwest of Syria through the World Food Programme. But the big problem is the politics, frankly, because the crossing points, the official humanitarian crossing points, have been reduced to just 1 as a result of various Russian vetoes at the UN Security Council over the last 2 years. Now, there has been an agreement to open up more crossing points, and that's important because at the moment there's if you like, a bottleneck of humanitarian traffic at the Turkey-Syria border, and that's a big problem.
David, we have an audience here of leaders in business and the financial community. If they are right now asking themselves or about to ask us, okay, what could I do if I wanted to do something to contribute, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd respectfully ask them to go to visit the IRC website, www.rescue.org, to see what we're doing on the ground, what the situation is on the ground. We don't want your viewers to get in a truck from elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere and drive to the Syrian border. That's not the best way to help. The best way to help is through organizations that have got credibility and legitimacy on the ground, because it's such contested conflict terrain that if you don't have legitimacy and credibility with the local people, you're not going to be able to make a difference. So I think that there is a need for the private sector as well as for governments to step up. I hope the private sector uses its voice and its muscle and its supply chains, for example, for medicines, as well as its financial resources.
And what about the regime of Mr. Assad? What role is it playing, if any, in this? Is it staying away? Is it participating? What is it doing?
The Assad government regime has come to an agreement with the UN to open more crossings, and it has promised to facilitate what's called cross-line aid. That's not cross-line between countries, that's cross-line between combatants, between government-held areas and rebel-held areas. One of the terrible stories of the last 12 years of civil war is that there's been effectively 0 cross-conflict line aid from the Damascus-governed parts of the country to the rebel-held parts of the country. But there have been promises to make a difference there. However, the most direct route to helping people in Idlib and Aleppo provinces is across the border from Turkey into Syria, and that's what needs to be facilitated.
David, thank you so much for being with us. That's David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, who served under Prime Minister Gordon Brown. I will not make that mistake again. Coming up, the 2024 race for the California Senate seat being vacated by Dianne Feinstein. We're going to talk with Democratic Congressman from California, Brad Sherman. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the Democratic Senator from California, Dianne Feinstein, announced yesterday that she would be not seeking another term in 2024. And this is what the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, also of California, had to say about her.
I think that Senator Feinstein has been an icon for our country. She has a record that is of the best in the United States Senate. For 30 years, she has served not only our state, but our country well.
That was Nancy Pelosi. And now we turn to another member of Congress from California, a Democrat. He is Congressman Brad Sherman. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, your thoughts about Dianne Feinstein.
30 years. Great job, much to be proud of, and she goes out with her head high and in just the right way at the right time.
So I don't want to rush her out the door, but we start to think about what comes next necessarily. We have a couple of declared candidates. As I understand it, you have a favorite.
Well, I've endorsed Adam Schiff, served with him for 25 years, represent contiguous districts, and I've seen what he's accomplished, particularly in protecting our democracy.
He's one of two announced so far. As your best guess, because you know politics in California very well, how many people do you think will go for this seat?
Well, Barbara Lee has indicated that she may well announce. That may be it, or there could be one of the statewide office holders that decides to get in as well.
And what is at stake as you look at the various Democrats? I mean, we haven't had a Republican senator, as I think, in 20 years or something like that. Is it a fairly safe seat, do you think, for Democrats? Or are there conceivably some Republicans who could step forward who might give one of these candidates a run for their money?
Ultimately, California is going to elect a Democrat. This is as safe a seat for Chuck Schumer as he's going to find. We don't know whether there'll even be a Republican on the ballot in November. If there is, we have this top two system, so we'll have a race in March. The top two go on to November. If there's a Republican on the ballot, then whatever Democrat's on the ballot can go to Hawaii and relax. If there are two Democrats on the ballot, it will be a fierce race. And although a Democrat will, of course, win, Republican voters will have an important voice.
Well, in that system, just to take me through it a little bit, my understanding is it's both Republicans and Democrats voting, so that Republicans could actually help determine who the Democratic nominee is. And Adam Schiff, we know from all his investigations, particularly of former President Trump, he's not a big favorite of President Trump's. Is there a possibility that you'd get some pro-Trump people actually voting to make sure Adam Schiff doesn't get it?
None of the Democrats who are running have particular appeal to Republicans. They're all strong progressives. And yet Adam Schiff is, of course, famous for the impeachment effort against Donald Trump. On the other hand, any Republican voter is, I think, going to know that there's no other Democrat in this race that's not a progressive and not anti-Trump.
So, Congressman, let's go back to the starting point here. You've said that you know Adam Schiff well, you've served with him, you support him in his candidacy. Why? I mean, what do you need in California? What do we need as a nation, for that matter, in the next Democratic senator from California?
Well, first, he's very capable and certainly a lot of experience serving in the House. His work in defending our democracy, both with the impeachment and the January 6th committee, I think is well known. And one advantage he has is that he's well known all around the state. It is so difficult for anyone seeking office to become known from Eureka to San Diego. In addition, I've worked with him on protecting our local environment with the Rim of the Valley initiative. And he has been a leader on foreign policy issues, particularly recognizing the Armenian genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. So I think he brings a lot to the table. And of course, being endorsed by Nancy Pelosi will mean an awful lot.
Yeah, it won't hurt him, I'm sure, in the state of California, without a doubt. Is it important at all if he is able or unable to work with people across the aisle? And I'm asking that in part because I'm thinking right now about the debt ceiling, that somehow we've got to get past, everyone agrees, certainly in the business community agrees, we've got to get past this. We can't not possibly renege on our debts. But do we need somebody who can work across the aisle in the Senate to get something done?
I think Adam can very much work across the aisle. He was very well known for that. It's only the advent of Donald Trump that has characterized Adam as a strong partisan. He's a progressive, but he's worked across the aisle on a host of issues, and particularly on the Intel Committee. As Congress has gotten more partisan, it's tougher, but I couldn't agree with you more. We have to extend the debt limit, and we have to do so on a clean basis. It's not a basis to negotiate about something else. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about fiscal policy. We need to, and we need to get the deficit down.
One quick one here at the end. Do you have an opinion on when President Biden should tell us whether he's running?
I think we already know, and he's welcome to reveal that at any time. But I think we know who the Democratic nominee is going to be.
Okay, Congressman, it's always a pleasure to have you with us and terribly helpful. That is Brad Sherman. He's Democratic Congressman from California. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter that is on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll go to Tel Aviv and talk with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Shapiro about the crisis over there in the judiciary. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.